As the civil rights movement was reaching its pinnacle, the rights revolution will be taken up by women, and women will start demanding greater equality in all areas of American life. This will usher in what's referred to as the new or second wave feminism. First wave of feminism involved women fighting for the right to vote specifically. Second wave feminism will involve three main areas. First, challenging domesticity, or women's place being in the home. Second, the public sphere. By the public sphere, that's especially equality in education and work. And third, the private sphere. And that will involve personal and body autonomy and women's right to self-determination or individual freedom for women. Now, before we talk about all of those, before we get into those, there is a concept that is very important to understand. And I bring up logical fallacies pretty regularly. I would argue that this is the most important logical fallacy to know, well, these two. And they're very closely related. First is the anecdotal fallacy. That is when people use anecdotes or their individual experience and then try to extrapolate to all of society and just far beyond what that anecdote actually implies. Second is the fallacy of extrapolation. So again, very related, and that is generalizing from either an individual or too few cases and extrapolating that far and wide. And this, from my experience, is the one that most often comes up, where people will make broad arguments based on an individual experience. And there are just so many examples. One that I've heard very frequently is, for example, COVID wasn't that bad because I didn't know anyone that actually died or went to the emergency room. I've heard a lot of people say that. The average human being knows at the very, very most, and when I say knows, I mean knows, not like Facebook friends, knows 150 people. And that is a very outgoing, very extroverted person to know about 150 people. In the United States, we have about 331 million people, so 150 is virtually nothing. It is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. So that is really important to understand in order to especially as we talk about this lecture. Individual experiences do not represent the majority. That's not to discredit individual experiences, because those are important. In fact, that is the purpose of oral history, is to get an individual's experience of what happened during these broad periods. And it's not even that anecdotal evidence is always wrong. For example, if I made a statement like, no one died of COVID, then you only need one piece of evidence in order to prove that wrong. That's why statements like everyone or no one or extreme statements like that, they're actually very easy to disprove because you only need one single piece of evidence. But make sure you know the anecdotal fallacy and the fallacy of extrapolation, because, again, it is one of the most common logical fallacies that you will experience throughout the course of your life. It is people using their individual example to explain the rest of the world. And it makes sense why they would do that, because throughout most of human history, we transferred information from one generation to the next orally. That's why one reason oral history is so important. That is also why this does tend to be generational, because older generations tend to engage in this more than younger generations, because younger generations have a tendency to understand macro data. You know, the concept that an individual's experience is just that, an individual experience. So keep this in mind as we go forward talking about this lecture. Now, what exactly started second wave feminism? There are two major reasons it began. And the first is the civil rights movement itself. That's something that first wave and second wave feminism have in common. Is first wave feminism one of the major driving factors of it? One thing that made it, one thing that really got it going was women supporting the abolitionist movement. And women supported the abolitionist movement, and then that translated into women supporting their right to vote. Ironically enough, when African Americans got the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, just a ton of them did not support women's right to vote. I think it was Frederick Douglass, a former slave, when he got the 15th Amendment, and he had supported women's rights, but when women were like, oh good, now support women getting the franchise, I think the quote was, it's the Negroes' time. And a lot of African Americans did not push for women's right to vote. And during second wave feminism, that will be another big factor. A lot of women will support the civil rights movement, but then, there were a lot of instances of them treated very bad. So supporting the civil rights movement was important for two reasons. One, they learned the tactics, and they will emulate a lot of the tactics to support the women's rights movement. But also, a lot of them were pissed off because there are a lot of examples of them being treated very, very bad. And civil rights leaders saying just blatantly sexist things. There was one civil rights leader. It was, I think it was the head of the Black Panthers, or Carmichael, that said women's role in this movement is to make sandwiches and paraphrasing, to provide sex for the men. So the civil rights movement was a huge factor. But the more important factor were economic considerations. There are some women that supported the greater equality and the civil rights, or the women's rights movement, because of the desire for equality, the desire for individualism, but an overwhelming factor was economic considerations. Because during the Cold War, the United States was going through a consumer culture, like the 1920s, but on steroids. There were large boomer families, buying all these fancy things for their suburban homes, like new TVs, new cars. And the higher standard of living wasn't just because it made people feel good. It was also part of the Cold War. Being or consuming and buying a lot of stuff was seen as pro-American, because Americans loved to flaunt how much better American standard of living was than the Soviet Union. So there is a massive consumer culture which will force a lot of women to have to go back into the workforce. Even ones that didn't want to will have to go back into the workforce just to pay their bills. So the economic considerations are the biggest reason for women, or for the women's movement starting. Just a little background. When World War II ended, women were expected to give up their jobs. The federal government actually made commercials showing women saying, well, now that the war's ended, I'm going to go back into the home because I need to clear up space for all the men coming back. And 2 million women, 1946 alone, 2 million women will voluntarily leave the labor market, but 4 million women will quit or will be forced to leave the labor market because they were fired because businesses wanted to free up jobs for men. So there will be a short dip in the number of women that were in the workforce, and then it will rise very quickly. The number of women in the labor force dips for a very brief period, and then it will increase. And by 1960, the number of women in the workforce was equal to the number that had been in the workforce during World War II. And one thing that was very notable of the women in the workforce was more than half of them were married. This is the first time that happened in a time of peace. In times of war, married women joined the workforce, but never in a time of peace. So in a time of peace, the number of women that will join the workforce increases and has been increasing ever since. This is really important to know. The rise in female employment is very easily, arguably, the single most important demographic trend of the post-World War II era. Post-World War II, one of, if not the single most important demographic trend is women joining the workforce, because it has so many implications and it affects so many things that we'll get to. And it affects all races, and of course it affects 50% of the population. So women going to the workforce, it is arguably the most important demographic change, and I will give examples of why as we move on. However, when women went back into the workforce, they found that they were discriminated against immensely. They were discriminated against in all sorts of ways. One of the most important was, well, a couple really important ones. When it came to higher education, they were largely shut out from law schools, medical schools, and training programs, and generally jobs that paid well. Also, they were relegated in the workforce to a very specific set of jobs that were female-only jobs, that were considered women's work. Some 80% of women were forced into just 4 occupations: flight attendant, nurses, teachers, and secretaries. One thing that unites all 4 of those fields is there is not room for advancement, promotion, and they pay relatively low. So women going back into the workforce will experience high rates of discrimination and the inability to advance in their careers. So those are the two big reasons that the women's movement starts. And the economics is arguably much the biggest reason. Now, second wave feminism, as I mentioned, had three main areas, and one of the big ones was challenging domesticity. And it was a challenge to what was called at the time the cult of domesticity, and a challenge to the nuclear family. So women were supposed to be in the home, and the home was supposed to be the place of salvation for men. Men were supposed to go into the workforce, and in the capitalist system, the workforce was highly competitive, it was unstable, and it was immoral. It's not meant to be moral. You do whatever you can to make a buck. And so men were in this highly competitive environment, and women were supposed to stay in the home, and they were supposed to create a safe space for their husbands, where they were supposed to promote good values, stability, morality, and democracy, and supposed to make the home a safe haven for the husband. So it was called the cult of domesticity. And it was part of what's called the nuclear family. That became the model of the Cold War, and to this day, it is still considered a model to a lot of people. The nuclear family consisted of a traditional household, obviously heterosexual parents, male, female, and of the same race, and with between 2 and 3 children. This was considered the primary unit of society, and women were supposed to be the core of this. That's one of the reasons that during the 1950s, marriage will reach all-time high up to that point, and for several decades to come. So marriage will reach an all-time high, and the average age of marriage for a woman was 19 years old. Now, must be mentioned that the nuclear family is not the norm in human history. And this goes back to that anecdotal fallacy. A lot of people will insist that this is the standard for marriage, and it is absolutely not, for all sorts of reasons. But throughout a lot of human history, multiple wives was the norm. But really importantly, the nuclear family involved the immediate family and not the extended family. That is a very American thing for the nuclear family or the immediate family to be a unit and to move far away from their extended family. That is very unusual in human history. And the United States, Americans are one of the most mobile people in the world. Americans move much more than a lot of other places. Americans have many more careers, and this all goes together. The reason Americans move so much is because for work. The United States, we are really, really good in this country about making money and making lots of money. And if you get a job offer somewhere else, then a lot of people will move very far, even from their family, for that job. And so it is part of the American culture. It's also part of the reason Americans are so isolated and report so much loneliness. There are places in the world called blue zones where people regularly live. Well, it's not uncommon for people to live over 100 years old. And one of the things they have in common is strong family units, and that's extended family units. So the United States will, the nuclear family will be considered the norm, and the cult of domesticity was considered women's sphere. And so that, challenging that is one of the major parts of second wave feminism. Now, a lot of second wave feminism will center on middle class white women and their lives being constrained by the nuclear family and the cult of domesticity. And we'll talk about that more in just a bit.